In a minute. Let's actually move this to after since Dan's here. Okay, I guess we could start it whenever. Did it start recording?
Yes, the meeting has started recording.
All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the January 16th, 2024 iteration of the Kubernetes SIG-Windows community meeting. As always, these meetings are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so be sure to adhere to the CNCF Code of Conduct. For everybody who's new here, that just means be nice to everybody. Or, I mean, it can be summarized as be nice to everybody. All right, let's get started with some announcements. First announcement is all of the meetings requests, or all the meeting recordings that we have. I think we were missing a couple from the end of last year. Those have all been uploaded to our YouTube playlist. And also in doing so, I've started to link to all of the recordings in each one of the meeting notes sections. I've seen some other SIGs do that, and I think it's just easier to find information that way. That's all the announcements I have. Arvind, Claudio, do you have any announcements?
Nothing from me.
Okay. Yep. And still, we're tracking, I think, first or second week in February for code or for enhancements freeze. So if we have time, let's spend a little bit of time today to discuss which enhancements we're going to be trying to progress for the 130 release cycle. Next, we'll give a little bit of time if there's any new contributors here that want to introduce themselves. If not, like, this is totally optional, but if anybody wants to say hi and or ask any questions or say what they want to get out of during the SIG-Windows meetings, please do so now. All right, I think most of the people here are familiar, so we can just get started. I think you invited Dan here to talk about the status of the entry Win kernel, or like the KPNG based Q-proxy.
Not the KPNG based
Oh,
one, but that's in KK. So I'm coming from SIG Network, and I guess we sort of co-maintain the kube proxy that's in tree. But we occasionally do refactoring and then find that the Win kernel implementation is doing something a little weird, and then we have to try to fix that. And we're just, I know that there had been this plan to move the Windows proxy out of tree, but I also know that like Jay was heavily involved in that, and he's gone now, or mostly not working on this stuff. So I guess I just wanted to figure out like what is SIG-Windows plan for kube proxy. Should we still be considering the in-tree proxy to be the future, or are you planning to get rid of it? And is it a written down plan?
I don't think that there's a written down plan. I think we have a couple of goals, but I do think that for the foreseeable future, we're going to need to maintain a version of the Win kernel kube proxy, and the entry one is the most I think the best place for that. I know from like SIG-Windows, we find it a little bit difficult to maintain because there is no container, or like when the Q-proxy container image gets built, there's no Windows flavor to that. And so we actually, in another repository, SIG-Windows tool, have been, every time there's a set of patch releases or a main release, we have some Docker files and some GitHub workflows that build the versions of the entry Windows Q-proxy and push them to still our Docker Hub, like a Docker Hub registry that we maintain. And we've been looking at different options to fix that workflow. I think James Sturdivant, who's unfortunately sick today, looked a little bit about updating the build workflow that we have now for the Q-proxy image, or that's in tree, and determined it would be pretty difficult to get a Windows container image built around that. So initially, especially when there was more momentum behind the KPNG-based Q-proxy, we decided to stand up another repository in Kubernetes SIGs, which we named Windows Service Proxy, and we were planning on having that host the Windows implementation of like the Win kernel proxy implementation for KPNG and some of the KPNG glue and put that in a container image and have that repository build the kube proxy that we wanted to support for Windows. Since momentum kind of died out there, one thing we were looking at doing was repurposing that repository to have some GitHub action workflows that would just build the entry kube proxy for whatever releases we want, or well, not build them, but just have some workflows that would grab the release artifacts, because we do build the Windows binaries for each release and stick that in a container image and publish that to the like gcr.kates.io registry to get rid of the Windows kube proxy image. So I don't know what the best path forward is for this. I think we're still kind of talking about this, especially since I think it's like we've really lost momentum in the WinKernel KPNG kind of plugin. So I think we're open to pretty much anything that makes it a little bit easier for us to maintain.
Okay. I mean, so like none of the people who are more closely involved with the SIG network side really know anything about the Windows specific aspects of it. So, you know, I don't think we can really be doing any more maintaining of the code than we're doing now. Although, you know, we are trying to make the sort of the core of kube proxy more separate and reusable, and possibly like stage that out to the kates.io/kube proxy repo. So in theory, it might be possible to, you know, get that. Well, I don't even know if you want it out of tree, but, you know, have the WinKernel kube proxy be out of tree while still being based on the core kube proxy code. If the, you know, the KPNG work is not panning out, whatever. Yeah, I know we build images. I don't really know a lot of the details of that, but I mean, it seems like building Windows images to go along with the Linux images, you know, sounds like a good plan that I'm sure everybody would support if, you know, someone stepped up and did the work to make it happen.
Yeah, I don't like for a lot of the other images, like the pause image, all the test images and things, we do build, like we do have Windows flavors just in a manifest list for the images. But I think that there were some, I think if I remember correctly, what was happening was the kube proxy, like the Windows binaries for the like official Kates builds for each release didn't like there was some mismatch in the frequency or the workflows that the KPNG, or I mean the entry kube proxy image was getting triggered off of, and the builds that had the full set of release artifacts for all of the different architectures. So I think that the workflows that were built around releasing the Linux kube proxy images didn't, like the builds that those were waiting for didn't include the cross, like multi-arch Kubernetes binaries. But I have not looked at this in quite a while.
Question. Where exactly can I find the exact process of the kube proxy image being built? Because I couldn't really find it properly. And I do remember some time ago, I was trying to add Windows images for another set of images, but it was a really complicated process for some reason, which didn't really translate at all for Windows images. There were some Kubernetes images, which basically how they were being built. They were being built normally, but they would be exported into OCI files and then again loaded into Docker for some reason, and then pushed from Docker upstream to some registry. Now, that workflow by itself is not possible for Windows images simply because you cannot do Docker load Windows images on regular Docker because it's a wholly different file system, and you know how things are being organized. Even the buildx workflows, how they're working and doing things, it's basically pushing in onto the registry directly. not even saving them locally, you know. So if you could point me towards the kubeproxy image building process, I can take a look and see if we can add the pipings necessary for Windows images as well. We've also done that for the pause image and a few other images like test images and so on and so forth. So if it's using BuildX, should be pretty straightforward thing to add.
I'm not actually sure where the kubeproxy image comes from. There's an image in the Kubernetes/release repository called distroless IP tables, which is the base image that is used. I assume the kubeproxy image must come from Kubernetes somewhere, but yeah, I don't actually know
Yeah.
exactly where.
I couldn't find it either. Some sort of make files or Docker files or something would be really useful to see the process. Because, for example, for the pause image, we found it and added all the necessary bits there. And since then, things have been easier to build since a couple of more features have been added to BuildKit, which makes it a lot easier to tag the proper versions and so on. So should be a more straightforward process nowadays. But yeah, have to find the image, the image and the actions first.
Yeah, I'm looking in the kates.io repository to see if if we can find what workflows are triggering that, but you can look at that offline. I guess, again, while we have you kind of asked like what are our plans? I might ask how do you recommend we maintain the kubeproxy for Windows, or like if we're using the like maintaining the same Win kernel proxy here, what would be kind of your recommendations for maintaining the Windows implementation binaries and potentially the container images?
I mean, binaries and container images, I don't really know. I'm not that involved with the the actual build stuff, even on the Linux side. I just work on the code. So yeah, other than that, it would be good if it's using the same. Well, I guess we know if it doesn't build because like that gets tested in CI. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not really the right person to ask about that.
Okay. Is there, so you mentioned that the kubeproxy core is probably going to stay in tree. Is the other implementations moving out of tree for the existing implementations, or?
There's not a plan to do that. We talked about that it might become possible, but haven't even really thought about like, would that make our lives easier or harder, or so. But yeah, the idea was that we want to get enough stuff into the kubeproxy staging repo so that you could build a proxy backend off that.
Okay.
And then, well, so we've just started with working on the NF tables based kubeproxy on the Linux side, and eventually want to get rid of IPVS and eventually even the IP tables. So there was some talk that, well, maybe we would move those out of tree,
Okay,
so that people could, like what happened with Docker shim, right? So people could still build them if they wanted, but we weren't having to maintain them. So I think eventually we're probably gonna do that, and so that's what will drive the work.
Okay. I mean, I know you were kind of the closest out of everybody's here to the KPMG stuff. Do you have any questions or anything to discuss here? I think, at least for SIG-Windows, I think one of the goals should be not maintaining a separate set of Docker files and processes that push to Docker Hub and figure out how to get that container image into a more official Kate's like Kubernetes registry. But other than that, I think there's a lot of that. I think that should be the goal. I don't really have opinions about the actual implementation for that yet.
Okay, yeah, I mean, to whatever extent you need, approvals or +1s from SIG network, we're happy to, get that happening, but I don't know the details of how you would do it.
I also think that there's a sort of a tangential question that I have is, do we have a clear owner for the Windows pieces inside kubeproxy? So that, Dan has been mentioning about the future work they're doing on the Linux side. Now, if we needed to do the equivalent of that future work on the Windows side, do we have a clear owner for that? Like, who will Dan William or Dan Winship ask? Hey, we're making these changes. We're going to pull this stuff. This is, I'm saying, I don't know, sometime deep in the future, we're going to pull out the IP table implementation, and then Windows needs it, right? What do we do at that time? And I think we need to be prepared for that day to come. So Mark, I don't know. This is not someone who's not from Microsoft who can take this on, right? Or is it someone who can take this on?
I mean, I know that like Sarvanth and a couple of other folks from Microsoft have been maintaining them. They've not been too active in SIG-Windows, but occasionally in SIG networking. I have not. I'll have to try and sync up with them to answer that. I'm assuming that they'd still kind of carry the torch for that. But I can try and get some confirmation to that, because I do think it's important, that we know who's kind of doing who would be investing, or who would be like kind of taking responsibility for keeping everything in sync.
Yeah, that's good enough, Mark. I just wanted to make sure it's on your radar that you need to get Travant or someone involved here, so that Dan is not left hanging when time comes to take all this out, and then we're like, oh, we don't have an owner. So let's get that ball rolling right now.
Looking over the changelog, it looks like Prince Pereira is the person who's done the most work. It's Windows specific there.
Yeah, I think he reports to Sarvanth here at Microsoft. So I'll sync up with Sarvanth too. But yeah.
But yeah, basically nobody in SIG network or nobody who comes to SIG network meetings regularly has much of a clue about the Windows kubeproxy code. I don't know. I mean, because I feel SIG Windows must have this problem with other components as well, where like you don't understand the details of that component, but the people who maintain that component don't understand the details of Windows.
I think we're more like, at least me personally, I'm much more plugged in with SIG Node. That's where I've been focusing, but so that's kind of helped to fill in that gap. But yeah, like a lot of folks in Node don't know anything about Windows, so we try to maintain an active presence there. I
guess it's mostly only Node and network that have strong, maybe storage, that have strong Windows like differences, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if I have either the bandwidth or background to do that for SIG or for networking too. So I'll try and reach out to Sarvanth to get that. If anybody else is super interested in Windows networking, though,
I mean, there are occasional things like, when we're talking about adding a feature and somebody will be like, oh, that would be hard to implement in the IPVS backend. And then we're like, gee, I wonder if Windows backend could implement this at all. And none of us know, because, we don't even really, know how it works. So yeah, it would be good to have somebody from SIG Windows more involved with SIG network more consistently.
Okay. We'll take that as an action item to try and find somebody to do that and get involved there.
Okay. I think that's about all I had.
Okay, great. I'll try and, after the meeting, fill in the notes. I realized we weren't taking notes here after I watched the recording, and add some notes to the meeting notes for this. But yeah, thanks for coming. I think that's pretty helpful. Does anybody else have any questions about networking?
So yeah, so then what about Capin inside SIG network? Like, is there some plan or some chances that this will become the default solution at some point, or is this stale, dead, sleeping?
So yeah, the problem with Kaping is that, you know, there was never a cap, like there was this cap way back 3 years ago or whatever, and then people were like, oh, this is boring, let's just write code. And then they went and wrote code for years and years with like no input from anybody else in SIG network. And so, you know, none of that code ever got reviewed or had people saying, oh yeah, this is a good direction to be going in, and I think it still doesn't fully pass CI. So yeah, there is no plan to adopt Kaping at this point, which and you know, the Kaping working group, whatever, has sort of collapsed a little bit. You know, I think the Friday meeting is now just called the SIG Network Hackfest or something, rather than being Kaping. So at this point, I think, you know, that, yeah, I don't know if anybody's really maintaining that code other than you. So I think unless you're, I don't know how much work you've done on top of that, but it may be better to try and you know, work with the version that's already in tree, or you'll get stuck maintaining all of Kaping basically.
Yeah, I tend to agree then. Like, me and Mark start to migrate this Windows service proxy out of tree, but it's based on Kaping, the backend. At this point, I do believe that the effort makes more sense to be inside creating this image and building tools around the entry that exists and reusing like the repository and all the infrastructure that Mark created for that, instead of like trying to move something that is huge forward. Just like to give like the last call on this, something we have been discussing. But yeah, thanks a lot for the feedback and like giving the overview of that.
Sure.
All right, I think, yeah, thank you. We have a couple minutes left. I think we can talk about which PEPs we're planning on progressing for 1.30. I know that Katana wants the, I think we're going to try and move the image poll per runtime class kept forward, but a lot of that is gated on if and when the container D changes get released with container D 2.0. So I think Katana said she needed to drop. I'll sync up with her. Arvind, how's the node log query one going? Do you
I think
potentially need help or want help with the kubectl plugin type stuff?
I might need some help with the kubectl plugin. That's the next thing that's on my plate. I have opened up the PR for reviews, the end-to-end PR, and I think that the end-to-end tests have been pretty green at the moment, the existing ones. So I think once we get this end-to-end PR merged, we could merge. You had some plans, Mark, of having like just one test job that tests like all the Windows alpha features. So the way I've written the test now, it will always test against Linux, and if it finds any Windows nodes, it'll run some Windows tests also. That's the way I've done the PR.
Okay, perfect.
So that should, you know, so if you add it to that other existing job, it should just work, is my theory. But take a look at the PR and just do the review, and let's get that merged. And then I'm going to start in the parallel, start working on the plugin. If anyone wants to help with that, I'm open to take help there.
Okay, taking down some notes. I think that's good. I don't know if this, I don't think that we're tracking any other, I don't think we're planning on progressing any other in-flight keps. Does anybody have any keps that they want to try and introduce as alpha for this release? If not, we'll probably focus on these two. And in addition to this, I think there's some other non-kep work that we're doing, especially around like the memory pressure and things. So And then I do realize like SIG-Windows DevTools and operational readiness, those are pretty like out of tree, so those aren't really subject to the same 130 deadlines. So that's why I'm not mentioning them in this section. I think that there is still a lot of like plans to make progress on there. All right, I guess that's the end of the agenda we have now, and we're almost out of time. Does anybody have anything else they want to discuss? I guess not. Arvin, can you stop the recording? I think you started it, and I'll get this uploaded then.